as well as sharing his own observations. With this brief introduction to this special session, I hand over to Dr. Virmani to chair the session and conduct the proceedings. Dr. Virmani.
Sorry, I just got, yeah, I guess I'm audible.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let me just, I'm not being able to see the button, so in case something happens. Okay, now I got it. Okay, so I guess we are running 6 minutes late, so let me start straight away. So we are going to basically what I'm going to do is kind of give you an overview, and then my other colleagues will there's somebody mute, please mute your, there's somebody who's unmuted. I don't know, there's some noise coming. Please. Vivek, please mute everybody. Vivek,
mute
please,
everyone.
except me.
And only the speaker will unmute.
Okay, so I've unmuted myself. I'll have to start again. So as I was saying, when I was rudely disturbed, never mind, you can start the recording now. Basically, I will give an overview and highlight some of the things, which I think are important, and then we'll have the other speakers. There may be a little overlap, particularly, for example, between me and Dr. Bhalla, where we have done similar research, but we have different perspectives, and I think it's very important for listeners to get the different perspectives. There's no harm in mild disagreements, and similarly, there may be a very little overlap between me and Dr. Charan Singh. I think Dr. Ratan Chand, Mr. Ratan Chand is not able to join us. So if I have a little time, I'll just say a little bit of health. He was going to cover health issues, but I'll just make the points, few points. That's all on that. So with that, let me start the talk by. I'm going to present the economic survey in an EGROW perspective. You will hear a lot of details, etc. In fact, I would commend that those of you who haven't seen the YouTube version of the CES presentation, actually that tells you what is in there. But what I want to do is present this economic survey from an EGROW perspective. And the reason is this, because EGROW's vision and mission, which many of you may not know, is in two sentences: research-based policy advice and policy-oriented research. And why I mention this is because there is a large measure of overlap between research and policy advice we have given over 2020, and which is now contained in the economic survey. This is partly why I'm taking this approach of putting it into EGROW perspective. Please don't unmute yourself. Keep it mute. Otherwise, you're disturbing the flow. Please. Okay, so the large overlap doesn't mean that we have complete agreement on either the research analysis or the view expressed. But what it does show is that I'm trying to give a reason why, in my personal view at least, this survey is a good one. And this approach they have adopted, they had started doing even in the previous survey. Now, pandemic lockdown. So that the first chapter of the survey is on the pandemic lockdown economics. And I'm going to just very quickly list the papers because, as I said, it's very so spread of coronavirus. We have two papers we did on the global spread in May and June at EGROW. Then in terms of pandemic crisis and solutions in 2020, we had a series of papers. In February, we talked about the pre-pandemic economy slowdown, the J curve, explained it by the J curve. In March, we had a paper on the macroeconomics of crisis. In April, we had a paper on lockdown economics, where we emphasized how this lockdown economics, particularly, for example, the V shape, when you lock down, let me come to that. Let me finish the overview. So in May, we had a detailed paper on lockdown economics in terms of monetary and credit policy. And then in June, we had a paper on tax reforms for re-accelerating growth post-pandemic. And what I would say is the economic survey, in a sense, supports and validates what our policy advice have been. Now, very quickly, to summarize what the policy research highlights, which some of you in our earlier talks have seen, the first one is that the imposition and lifting of lockdown, we had said very early in one of the early papers, will have a kind of V-shape effect, will have a very strong V-shape effect. And we were surprised that people are surprised at the minus 23% growth. We had predicted that in our second paper among the ones I referred to. And it followed from that once you lift the lockdown, there would also be a very sharp recovery. So this V-shaped recovery in those early phases, in H1, which the economic survey has emphasized, we had already predicted, but that doesn't mean the V-shape will continue in H2. And here we may have some differences, but the recovery has proved to be very good. We'll discuss at some later date on what happens exactly in H2. But the basic ideas are completely overlapping between the survey and what our research has shown. The second highlight of our analysis, which gradually everybody has adopted in their own analysis, very gradually, they resisted in the beginning. We put up an analytical framework, which is kind of like a 3x3 matrix, and we emphasized three broad sectors: essential goods and services, contact services, and the rest of the economy, mainly manufacturing, mining, and construction, and three phases of recovery: survive, revive, and regrowth, which I named to summarize those instead of getting into details. So this framework has stood the test of time, and now virtually everybody basically has started thinking in those terms. And economic survey does it too. It doesn't go too much into the essential goods and services, but it talks about agriculture and rural, which is what it was. That was the main component of that. And thirdly, the monetary credit policy, which we emphasize right from the start, based on our specific theoretical and empirical analysis, that both monetary credit policy and fiscal policy must be targeted very specifically by subsectors, and it will vary over phases. So basically, economic survey supports and validates our policy advice. So we are not only happy, but we also think that means that the survey is a good one, because if it hadn't, recognized what we think are good research and policy, perhaps it would have not been as good. Okay, so let me come to the second point. I'm sure Dr. Bhalla will have more to say on COVID and some of the related things. I'm not going to go into those details because we did some papers jointly together. He has done other papers by himself. The second aspect which I want to kind of highlight is the fiscal. Everybody keeps asking about fiscal deficit, debt, GDP, sustainability, etc. The economic survey has this as the second chapter. Now, later on, perhaps Dr. Charan Singh will expand on it, but I want to just make a few broad points. Firstly, the issue of fiscal deficit in the year which is about to end and the next year, FY22, it has to be thought of differently from the long term, the future trend in the debt GDP ratio. Now, why is that? Very, very quickly. Firstly, in the current year and the year following, at least for the next 6 months of the new year, we can't worry about the fiscal deficit. There's no need, there's no necessity to worry about the deficit, and the economic survey has highlighted some of these things, and Dr. Charan Singh will maybe talk about some of the others, though he'll focus on the second part. So we shouldn't raise taxes. That will be pro-cyclical. There is little argument for raising taxes to raise revenues. So whatever the revenues are, those should be taken as given. Second, there's no need to lower efficient expenditures. In fact, one can rightly argue that introducing more expenditures, say on well-targeted expenditures on areas like health, etc., which have been highlighted by the pandemic, is a good thing. However, when we come to the long-term stuff, which has been discussed, then my reading of history and the economic surveys has said that fast GDP growth is being shown across the world to be critical to reducing the debt GDP ratio. Actual measures, like for example, the UK took after the global financial crisis, by just crunching down on necessary welfare expenditure, doesn't help you lower the debt GDP trajectory. However, anything which accelerates the growth, like revenue neutral tax reform or efficiency in the health system or income transfer, will help you do that. So that's the main point. Excuse me, I'll just... Okay. Now, the third point I want to make is on economic growth, poverty, and income distribution. Dr. Bhalla knows much more about income distribution. He's done a lot more work on that. But the other two issues, I will just give a flavor of the results which my own studies have revealed. And again, it is consistent with what the economic survey is saying. 2 or 3 points here. One, our research on growth and poverty showed that between 1950 and 80, the growth, per capita GDP growth decelerated and poverty went up. While from 80s, when the reforms started hesitatingly and then picked up speed, both the growth rate accelerated and the poverty rate declined. So this is a fact which you can find in some of my old papers. The second point, which was based on more recent research done in the late 2000, something like between 2006 to 9, which showed that which was much more careful research in what they call, which CA has also talked about, this double difference approach, that and based on interstate data, it showed that the higher the rate of growth of GDP, per capita GDP is really what important. Whenever I say GDP now in this context, is per capita GDP growth, not GDP growth as such, but adjusted for population. And the faster that is, the faster the poverty is reduced. So states which grew faster also had more poverty reduction. And a secondary aspect was that at least during the earlier period, when agriculture was much more important, if this growth came from agricultural growth, the decline was even faster. I'm not sure whether this is still valid in the overall for the country, but probably for the poorer state, the more agricultural dependent state, this is still valid. Maybe Professor Vishan Das may want to comment on this later, but I'll leave that. The second very interesting result was that there is a reverse causation. And this is probably the first time what I found was that higher the share of bottom 40% of the population in consumption, the faster the economic growth rate. So states which had higher consumption share of the bottom 40% grew faster. I mean, it added to the growth. Now, this is a very interesting result, which is published in EPW, which people don't remember. What that means is that if we are going to have income transfers and subsidies, it is better to direct them at this bottom 40%. Okay, that will give double benefits. It benefits the poor and the less well off. It also helps accelerate growth when we think in an interstate India context. And again, all these things are consistent with what the survey is saying, which is why I'm highlighting them, And there are a couple of two other points I want to make in this. One is that what we say that why is the inequality, that growth is important for dealing with inequality, is because higher growth is very clearly linked to higher revenues, the tax revenues. And the more tax revenues you have, the more you can spend on public goods. And it turns out again that World Bank and other studies have shown on India, when they compared across to other countries, that the inequality in some of the public goods and services was much worse in India. That means we had not paid enough attention to public goods, and public goods are very hard to substitute. So only the richest people can buy, in a sense, their own public goods, which means that the poorer people get left behind. So this revenue, if it makes possible public goods investment, helps the poor more. So the inequality then goes down. Okay. So that is the link which I have, from my personal thinking and research, come across. I'm sure Professor Dr. Bhalla will tell you more about this. And just mention it and leave it. We had a basic needs approach for a long time. Now they are calling it bare necessities approach and index, etc. And only thing I want to say is that what I find, I think it's useful to have a state index. Again, I'm not a big fan of global comparisons of indices because they are built on kind of assumptions which may not hold. But across states, because it's the same country, same India, same type of people, society, etc., they are very useful for two purposes. One is intertemporal comparison, i.e., how have any state or the country fared over time? Okay, is it improving, worsening, etc.? And second, in interstate comparison. So if index is worse, then the state is obviously doing not so well on these indexes. So perhaps I hope Dr. Bhalla may want to talk more about this. Now, in conclusion, I want to make two quick points from my personal experience and reading on two important issues which the survey has highlighted. It has separate chapters on it. One, of course, is this sovereign credit rating. I'm sure Dr. Singh and others will talk about it, but I just want to mention my own personal experience because I handled this issue from the time of the 91 crisis. And one of the arguments we used to make, we always used to say that the credit rating you're giving us is worse than we think it is. And so what the survey does is it has given us a whole bunch of, I forget the exact number, 10 to 20 different sub categories of things which show that our credit rating should be higher. But I must mention one thing which we found when we did this and argued with them. There was only one index which was worse for India, and that is fiscal deficit. That's a fact. Only one. So if you think of it in this survey's perspective, out of, let's say, 15 different indices which suggest we are under thing, there's only one index which shows that it is right. And what we argued, because they are stuck on it, they are obsessed with fiscal deficit. So what we had argued at that time, this is 91, 30 years ago, was that we are actually less vulnerable because of fiscal deficits, because we have a high household and private domestic saving. If you compare with any of the countries which have higher rating, most of these are in developed countries, you will find their household saving rates are a fraction of what it is in India. And I still remember the two examples we gave, which came close to us among the developing countries, was Japan, which had a very high household saving rate, and Italy. And at that time, both these countries were had much higher credit ratings despite their relatively high fiscal deficits. The last point on innovation. I think that's an excellent thing, where one of the things which they have found is that in private share of R&D in India is very low. It's 37% compared to 68% in the top economies. They of course show that India is not doing badly, but we want to do better and compete with the top 10. Then this is a relevant fact. Now, they have not given reasons for it. And very recent research, which I came across like in the last week, gives a very interesting reason for this. And the reason they found is that innovation is low when there are highly obstructive, complex, rigorous, not rigorous, but complex labor laws. Amazing result, which I just happened to come across in the last week. What does that suggest? That this, of course, we haven't done all the research, but what this suggests to me is the private sector may be doing less research because of the same issue, because our complex, the laws, labor laws were terrible, which also means that we have a very good test now. If the new labor codes have simplified the labor laws quite dramatically, and if the rules which are expected to be announced by March 31 turn out to be as good as the labor laws suggest they should be, then we should see a rise in the R&D of private companies over the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years. This is going to be a very, very interesting experiment, provided that we go through with this, labor law reform in all its intensity. So with that, let me kind of stop and invite Dr. Sujit Bhalla to give his comments and analysis or whatever he wants to show us. Thank you. Dr. Bhalla, can't see you.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you, and good morning and good evening. So let me just go through. I think Arvind has done a super job in covering most, if not the entire survey, in summarizing. I will divide my comments into three parts: the social, the macro, and the lockdown. So in somewhat in reverse order to what is presented in the survey. So what I found on the social side, the last chapter is actually quite thrilling, and it is I don't think they've drawn the exact implications from it, but it does highlight very clearly and much more lucidly what's happening with inequality and political fortunes. If you look at the map, the bare minimum, and I really like that chapter showing as to how the bottom 40-50% on various characteristics have benefited enormously over the last 5 years. And one would have liked to have seen that same comparison with earlier years, but nevertheless, I think that's a very, very exciting chapter and innovative in the way they present the data and relate it to which regions have benefited and which shares. So very high marks on that chapter. The inequality chapter, I must say, I was quite disappointed with. There isn't anything new or innovative in that chapter. Repeats quite a bit of the old received wisdom. And, it is a commentary on India, not so much on the economic survey, that you have to repeat that growth is a major factor behind declines in inequality. But, so maybe that is why the chapter has that discussion, but I didn't find too much. The innovation chapter also is path-breaking, and I found that very, very innovative in terms of presenting what has happened. So very high marks on the innovative chapter as well. Now coming to the macro, and I've been following a little bit of the debate that happened in India, the few shows I could watch, and surprisingly, and maybe not so surprisingly, a lot of the commentators gave short shrift, not Arvind, but gave short shrift to this chapter. I think it needs to be highlighted what they have done, and there is a puzzle there and cannot be dismissed very easily. I would have added the following to that discussion on credit ratings. I think the chapter is spot on in terms of that there is a genuine puzzle and cannot be dismissed in a knee-jerk fashion, as some of the commentators have done. One aspect about this, and which I've been trying to push at the fund, is if you look at the borrowing, the foreign borrowings, government borrowings from offshore, or not offshore, but external, the interest rate differential between what a borrower pays in the US versus sovereign borrowings, I'm talking about, versus what developing countries face. And this I'd done some time back, and the same thing holds, that over the last 20 years, the each, and included Brazil, India, etc. So you looked at what rates they paid and looked at the exchange rate differential loss that happened in these economies. And it turned out that practically every economy out of 20, and these are the major economies, including Brazil, etc., would have been better off not, if you will, that they would have been better off borrowing, or sorry, let me rephrase that. The amount that they paid extra for borrowing from abroad far exceeded the exchange rate loss that a lender would have suffered. So in other words, it would have been very profitable if you did not hedge the borrowings. In that regard, and this is of course consistent with the fact that over time, the real exchange rate in developing countries will have a tendency to appreciate, not depreciate. So, and this exercise was done over the last 20 years and points to the same puzzle of how not the credit rating agencies in this case, but the commercial banks are profiting from this imperfection in the marketplace. So if developing countries, and I've been arguing here at the fund, that the fund should provide an insurance scheme so that the rates of interest that developing countries pay on borrowings is reduced. And that doesn't mean that India should pay the same rate as Argentina, but it does mean that the dispersion in the rates, borrowing rates, should be allowed to come down, and an insurance scheme will do that. So full marks on to the survey for highlighting this credit ratings problem. And as I've said, this is a long-standing problem and has more to do with political economy than perhaps economics, but it is nevertheless very important that we consider. On fiscal deficits, look, there is why fiscal deficits, let me put it more bluntly, it is very difficult to find the relationship of the size of the fiscal deficits to anything under the sun, including inflation. So why countries give that much importance to the fiscal deficit is something that I've been arguing for the last 22 years, actually. I gave a seminar at the Ministry of Finance at the invitation of Montague way back in 1998, discussing this very same issue. So I think indirectly, the survey seems to support that view, that something is wrong with the analysis. And I think this has to do, in my view, the same thing as the credit rating, etc. There is a new macro, and the new macro has it that inflation is not a problem anywhere in the world. And I'm excluding Zimbabwe's and hyperinflation countries. But inflation is not a problem. If inflation is not a problem, and you have the advanced economies which set the interest rates, the policy rates, and therefore the borrowing rates lower for longer, I think I would have liked the survey to go a little bit more in depth on that issue. But I think their conclusion on the IRGD, the interest rate and the growth differential, points to cautiously that the fiscal deficit is not that much of a problem. Then we have one thing I should mention, going back to the social side, on the health and education, that for long it has been the case that if you look at the health and education expenditures, total in India is very comparable to other developing countries. So, let's take the oft quoted 5 to 6% expenditures on education. The government spends somewhere around 3%, and the private expenditures on education is also around 3.5%. So what you have is that we may have a problem in terms of the composition of spending on education and health. Health, for example, the government spends only 1%, and the private sector, individuals like you and me, etc., spend something like 6%. So one needs a more concerted discussion on these rates rather than that we are spending too little. I'm not saying that the survey says that, but it is part of the common conventional and wrong wisdom in India that we are spending too little on education and health. And the same story actually on taxation. I missed a discussion of taxation in the economic survey. And again, where in a comparative sense, we get a lot more from direct taxes in India than in most other countries. And I think that's also something that needs to be corrected for the growth rates to emerge as we would like. On the recovery, I completely agree with Arvind, and I was just looking at export data, and the exports in April were down to, or May, were down to about 1/10 of what the level now is and the regular level. Now, we're going to see a very sharp recovery in April onwards. Just the April, May, June, that quarter, which was down 24%, is more than that, much more than that is going to be made up in the April to June quarter. So I think what you pay on one side, you get back on the other and maybe more, especially if some of the institutional reforms like labor laws come into play. Last on the lockdown. I was, and Arvind and I have worked a lot on this, and others have as well. I found that chapter more than a bit disappointing in that I couldn't quite find the conclusion is that the lockdowns work, and maybe I missed it, but I couldn't find any documentation, empirical documentation, that the lockdowns were the ones responsible for flattening the curve in India. If anybody else has noted that, I would love to be enlightened. And on the lockdowns itself, I mean, apart from the heuristic arguments, it would be, the later chapters, I think the innovation chapter and another one also shows regression results, so you can easily see what is being discussed here, or what is being, how the conclusion is being reached at. In this case, it was, I can't find the panel regression which ostensibly shows that the lockdown worked. Maybe I missed it, but I think I was, the fact that it comes out. So in summary, the first chapter is the weakest chapter, and the last chapter on the bare minimum is the best chapter. So I would have organized it somewhat differently. But broadly, I think, it touched on the survey touched on some very important issues and divergences in thinking, both in India and abroad. And in that regard, I think the survey, the writers need to be congratulated for highlighting some conundrums about the Indian economy. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Sujit. I just want to highlight one issue which because Ratan is not going to be here for health, but I think very important point which Dr. Bhalla has made, that the important thing is the division of both health and education expenditures between public and private. That's very important because, when I somewhere around, where was it? I think around 2006, I was asked to do a review of social sectors. And my point was basically this, that if, that the main problem is not the total expenditure, it's the quality of the public health expenditures, that people don't want to use that. I mean, why would people not use a free public health system and a public education system? They are not idiots. And unless you improve that quality and find out why it is not improving and how to improve it, just talking about doubling expenditure, tripling expenditure is kind of almost meaningless and maybe dangerous. And particularly important in the current context because, what I would put more practically is that have a plan. Where is it that you now want to increase, like public health education, sewage, R&D? Okay, I can understand. If you have a specific thing you want to increase, that's fine. But just talking about doubling government expenditures and all health systems are very poor, just doubling them is not going to improve those poor health systems unless we know how you're going to improve the quality of the public health system, for example. Anyway, so that's one. The second thing where I would have liked, but maybe Dr. Bhalla can come back later, is that, this is also for the public. So you talked about received wisdom on inequality. So it would have been nice, maybe you can later in the program, you can tell not everybody knows the literature, and you have worked so much on it. It'd be nice to have a summary of the received wisdom, but we'll come back to that. So let me now turn over to Professor Ashok Vishendas, and he's going to talk about the agriculture chapter, I think, in the survey and issues connected with it. Professor Vishendas.
Thank you very much. I hope I am audible. I am going to discuss only on one chapter, agriculture and food management, that is in volume 2, chapter 7. It is very well done. It has covered a lot of width, but in certain aspects the depth is missing, and therefore I also congratulate the writers of the economic survey 2021. But let me also highlight the good points and also not so good point one by one. Now, agriculture is very resilient. It is the only sector in the COVID period which posted a positive growth at 3.4% against the negative of 23.9% for rest of the economy. So this is a very positive thing, and we have to congratulate our Kisan, our farmers, and the agriculture community as a whole. This is one thing. And let me come straight to the agriculture trade policy. Now, our agriculture export, we have a lot of agriculture commodity which has a lot of potential for export, but somehow we are not able to achieve the full potential. Now, this why we have not, on one hand, our agriculture export has touched about 43 billion US dollar in 2016-17, which has dipped to less than 37 billion dollars. Now, there is no analysis why it is happening. Now, my understanding is agriculture trade policy has been somewhat unstable. Now, for the short term supply bottlenecks, for instance, onion is a case in point, then there is a statewide thought on the government's mind to stop, ban, put certain restriction, minimum export price, and so on and so forth. This is not going to help. Now, this not only reduces our export potential, it reduces the income of the farmer, and the story does not stop here. We lose the face. People see us with suspicion that Indian farmers are not reliable. So when you have made the international commitment, you had to honor it. Now, the farmers and their organization are under compulsion. They cannot honor. Now, when these bans are lifted, it's not electricity. You switch off the light, and when you switch on, the light will come. Now, if you straightway lift the ban, then there is a lack of trust and credibility, and we lose the faith. So, stable trade policy in agriculture is required. Now, agriculture growth, the share of crops in the agri-GVA is reducing. It was 11.2% 2016-17. Now it has come down. Now these crops have been taken over by marine products, livestock, and all those things. Why it is happening? It's a good thing according to my assessment, but regions are not assigned why it is happening. GCF in agriculture, gross capital formation is fluctuating. No reasoning is given, only a description of the story that it has been fluctuating. In 2016, it came down, and it has been hovering in the range of 14 to 17%, no reasoning. Now, this is the lacuna in the economic survey. Now, we have to see the credit for the agriculture. 86% of farmers are small and marginal. So the credit requirement is very, very high, and the government has set a target of 13.5 lakh crores as a credit to the farmers, which has been achieved in 2019-20, and in 2020-21 it has been upscaled to 15 lakh crores for 2020-21, of which 65% has been achieved. till November. That's fair enough, and this is very good thing. Now, PM Kisan Saman Nidhi, rupees 6,000 is paid. That's fine. And on MSP, the survey says to protect the farmers' interest, the MSP has been increased. Now, here my objection is MSP is an instrument of price fixing. It's not an instrument for income. So it is brought out as if it's a income instrument. And if you achieve an instrument, if you use the instrument of pricing for the purpose of augmenting the income, I think we are in the wrong path, and therefore we have to do the analysis very correctly. And increasing MSP is not an answer. It has to be in sync with the domestic prices and international prices. So no comment on that has been given in the economic survey. And next point is the FCI, the stocks of FCI that brings out about 38 million tons of rice has been procured and 37 million tons of wheat. So these two commodity alone accounts for about 76 million tons in one single year, that is 2020. Now, what happens? This is way above the buffer stock. Now, it's a cost to the nation. We have not given any reason why it should be that level. It should be offloaded in a suitable manner, but the government is not doing, and no commentary why they are holding the stocks over and above, way above the buffer stock now prescribed by the government themselves. So this is another. Now, rice, we have to note that rice is a water guzzling crop, and it also has been recommended that rice will be used for ethanol blending program. This is a bizarre. On one hand, our water tables are going down, and then you are using the rice, which consumes about 1,500 to 2,000 liters of water per kg of rice, and then you are using for ethanol blending and for petrol. This is beyond the comprehension. So government has not given any reason why rice has been used for this. Agri insurance. Now they say the agriculture insurance, so many farmers have been benefited. I think this is a bit insult to the farmer. Suppose my car is stolen or damaged, and I get the money for insurance, and I am labeled as if I have benefited from that insurance. We have to be very careful when you use for the farmers. It's not a benefit that government has given against the crop damage. And there is no data has been given how and when those insurance claims are settled, and how much the claims were made, and how much they paid to the farmers. So those things have to be, and then why the insurance of the crops penetration is quite low. No reasoning is given. And under the Prime Minister Garib Kalyan Ann Yojana, 80.96 crore beneficiaries have been provided additional food grain over and above what is permissible under the usual program of food security. That's a very good thing. And I would also expect the agriculture insurance company, how much profit they have made. My understanding is they make inordinate profit, but no data is given, because their profit will give how much farmers are being paid. To simply tell that so many farmers have been given the claims and so-called benefited, you are not giving how much the money insurance company made. So those have to be balanced. With these things, I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Vishnu Das. Before I turn to Dr. Charan Singh, I just want to point at, I think, one or two things. First, I think that's a very valid point. I often wondered, and I've hesitated to speak, that this use of water-intensive crops for making ethanol doesn't, on the face of it, make much sense. So I think that's something which government and analysts and expert must think about very carefully. The second point about insurance, actually, agriculture insurance, I've dealt with it over my career in government a lot of times. And one of the things which, I still remember, which many people don't seem to be aware of, is I remember that peanut insurance, there's too much uncertainty, and it's just not viable. So I think one has to be careful. The premium required, if I remember correctly, was something like 30% of the crop value, and that's totally unviable. There's no crop. So one has to think, why is the crop grown there if there is so much uncertainty and so much variation that insurance is not even feasible? So some of these things one probably has to be a little more careful analysis, and there's some things which are a puzzle, I guess the way to put it, which as Dr. Bhala did, that some things are puzzle even to a rational economist and so on. But otherwise, the general point, of course, remains. With that, Professor Dr. Charan Singh, would you like to?
I must thank Dr. Virmani to have suggested this discussion on the economic survey 2 days later, so that we can all read the chapters and come out with well thought of appreciation or suggestions for further improvements. It is in this context that I'll be only talking about the 3 chapters in detail, and I'll talk about 2 chapters not in so much detail. The chapter I want to speak about in detail is the one on sustainability. In a way, the topic is very good and it's very timely. The reason being that we are in COVID and the tax collection is not going to be there, obviously, as much as we would have expected in normal course of trajectory. The deficit is going to widen, that is obvious. And then we will have to borrow to meet our basic necessities and expenditure. And those are the subsidies, and those are the interest payments, as well as salaries and pensions, and those are the expenditure which we will have to. So the chapter is positioned well, and I think it's very timely to discuss this chapter. In the chapter, the authors speak about the need for counter-cyclical fiscal policy, and they say that it is necessity that the counter-cyclical fiscal policy is adopted. Now, in India, with private consumption accounting for nearly 54% of GDP and investment accounting for nearly 29% of GDP, and now there is so much of uncertainty on that, this counter-cyclical fiscal policy assumes great importance. That's very well accepted and taken. The fiscal multiplier during recessionary phases or slowdown phases is estimated to be 2.48, and therefore it shows it's very effective, as against 0.57 during expansionary phase. So therefore, this is the time to make the best of this fiscal multipliers. Now, the chapter argues, and I'm not very sure on the rigorous basis of this, and as you know that my own research has been on debt management for many years, my own PhD in which I had looked at the debt and consumption, debt and price level, and debt and growth. So I've looked at these issues, and I would have expected a little more rigorous analysis in this aspect. But the chapter continues in its journey, and then argues that growth determines the debt sustainability. Now, debt sustainability has been defined in a very simple way, and I agree with that simple definition. Actually, that definition came from Domer in an article which was published in 1944 in the American Economic Review. And what it said is that if the growth of the economy is faster than the rate of interest, then obviously you will be in a sustainable state. and your debt equation will not explode. Of course, that has been reiterated over and over again and in recent times, but surprisingly, the donor piece was not even mentioned in that article. Nevertheless, the R minus G concept that has been adopted is good, and the story is that it is growth oriented. If it is negative, R minus G is negative, so that is okay. Now, what the results are showing that emerging countries where the growth is generally large, this is sustainable. So therefore, that is where the rigor is required. Is it just that much of the story? Now, of course, the debt analysis given in the chapter is reasonably good. It speaks about the center and state share, 70 to 30, speaks about the external to internal, which is 6% to 94, and therefore the exchange rate risk will not be attracted to that extent, which is fine. Now, the issue that I have in this is, yes, if growth is higher than the interest rate, and when they did the projections, they have taken some projections, but I would have looked at in a very different way, looking at the weighted average rate of interest on the existing debt and how to project it further. And if we are going to increase our borrowings, it's going to have some impact on crowding out. They did talk about crowding out in the chapter, but I think it needed a far more rigorous analysis than what is presented. The other issue that I have is this 3% and 60% of deficit and debt, respectively, ratios to GDP, which come from the Maastricht Treaty. I would have expected that these need to be challenged and seen what is more sustainable in the context of an emerging country like India. Now, as Dr. Bhalla was saying, I'm total agreement with him. Where is the empirical evidence to show that the rising deficit will lead to high inflation? And Dr. Bhalla is at the IMF now and with his wide experience in the World Bank. I have been asking people both at the IMF and the World Bank when I was there, as well as professors at Harvard when I did my postdoctorate with them, what is the sanctity of 3% and 60% of deficit and debt GDP ratios? None. And therefore, I think we need a more rigorous analysis to establish that these two ratios are really not, need not be taken so seriously because they somehow stifle growth. The last point I want to make on this chapter is, however, if the borrowing is growth oriented, capital expenditure should generally be rising or investment should generally be rising, but that's really not been happening. So it needs a little more in-depth analysis. I would now like to move on to the next chapter, which I want to focus on, is on the process reforms. The chapter starts well. It talks that there have been certain constraints, and I don't agree with this term, but let me just tell you in a nutshell. The chapter speaks about overregulation and then says that it is not because of lack of compliance to processes, but it is overregulation which is stifling growth. Now, I agree, you can't regulate everything because unknowns are there and those need to be factored in. So some discretion has to be brought in. But then how much of discretion has to be brought in? Now the chapter makes a good suggestion, but I'm not sure how practical it is. So the chapter says our regulation should be simple. And I agree, because Dodd-Frank Act, as you know, in that 848 pages that they had really made 390 new rules. And if you look at those rules, 184 more additional activities were being entrusted upon the board of the banks, which is almost very, very difficult. And it would make the regulatory complexity far more higher. To that extent, I agree. Even in India, when in the chapter speaks about, and I'm happy that they're transparently talking about it, that it takes to close a business nearly 1600 days, nearly 4.5 years, whereas in other countries it will take less than a year. And in country, if it is a large company, in our country, if it's a large company, it takes nearly 10 years, whereas if it was in a country like Germany, it would take only 2 to 4 years. So to that extent, the chapter has discussed at length. It then recommends that you need to improve transparency, you need to have stronger systems, ex ante accountability. Now that's very difficult to fix, ex ante accountability. And then you have to have resolution mechanisms, which I totally agree. Only thing that I want to bring in this chapter is how much of transparency is appropriate and how much of transparency is more transparency. Now, why I'm mentioning this specifically is we all know the case of the US and how India was not respected in the pre 2008 Lehman Brothers episode. India was highly regulated. The American financial system was light touch regulation, and we all know what happened there. So, therefore, the recommendations of the chapter on transparency, I think, needs to be more rigorous. How much and what, and on ex ante accountability again needs to be rigorous. That brings me to the last detailed analysis that I would like to give on the forbearance chapter. Now, on this chapter on forbearance, the authors speak that the forbearance which started in 2008 had lasted little longer than it should have. It should have, according to the authors, closed in 2011. It carried on, which was not correct. And because it carried on longer than it should have, it has led to lots of wrong or unwarranted or undeserving restructuring that happened. And this has led to more difficulties in terms of non-performing assets which are disguised and which will come up sooner or later. Now, this, according to them, is not even good for the commercial banks, not even for the firms. So the point they make, and that point is well taken, but I have my own arguments which I want to place now. The point that they make is emergency diet should not be treated as a staple diet. What forbearance was granted in 2008 should have closed by 2011 because things had started recovering, because it got extended. Therefore, the bad loans continued. And what actually were NPAs were now disguised as structured or restructured loans. And therefore, to that extent, the capital of the banks was understated. Banks were already undercapitalized, but it was not showing up. Then they argue that they have been paying dividends and all that, but I think that's besides the point. Internationally, then again, they mention, and I think there also rigor is required, that the countries which resolved late showed high NPAs than the countries which resolved earlier, which is okay, but I think that needs a rigorous analysis. Now, the issue is that the chapter recommends another asset quality review, which somehow I feel that across the planet, when all the banks and the financial institutions are in a difficult state, and not because of their own reasons, but because banks are only a reflection of the overall economy. If the overall economy is in stress, obviously the balance sheet of the banks is going to be under stress. So I'm not sure what next asset quality review would really require. On the other hand, if we need to recapitalize the banks, it would have been far more better if the chapter had recommended that the recapitalization, which is becoming obvious world over, as also in India, would need the following conditionalities. And these conditionalities should be imposed. And therefore, I think that chapter needs more rigor rather than simply saying that asset quality review will bring out everything. Now, last 2 points that I want to make. One is on the credit rating, and I totally agree with what has been said before me. I have been arguing on this for a number of years now again, and obviously after the ILFS and the Divan housing, which came in public light and being discussed extensively, I have always said that the rating agencies need to be more accountable and more transparent. Nobody knows what are the procedures that they follow, what is the methodology that they follow, and what is more that they know that the regulator in terms of the central bank or a regulator in terms of the Securities Exchange Board do not know. And therefore, just by simply saying that our ratings are simply indicative in the banking and financial institutions should follow their own protocol and should have their own internal ratings or their own information, I don't think absolves them. And therefore, I think there is time that the rating agencies should also be penalized if the ratings go hayway and the institutions suffer. The last point I want to make is, and that is overall on the economic survey, as you know, that output is determined by labor and capital. On health, the chapters have been devoted, almost 3 chapters. But I think hardly any chapter, and this is where I think I go with Dr. Bhalla, hardly any chapter on education not dedicated. I would have expected something more because we recently had the education policy, and I thought there'll be some analysis there. Also, during COVID, lots of employment has been impacted. Migration, nearly one-fifth of the labor force has moved back, and therefore there's been massive movement in the labor force. Employment, I would have thought the survey would have been more rounded if in the analytical chapters in the beginning there was something dedicated to employment. Thank you very much.
Sorry, it takes a little time to unmute. Okay, so I guess our last speaker, given that Mr. Ratan Chand is not here, Dr. Mahinder Pal Singh, who will speak a little about the defense. Actually, I haven't seen the chapter on defense, but I guess you're generally going to, pre-budget type of thing. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, sir. Well, there is certainly no chapter on defense, but it does include the talk on defense expenditures and also about the procurement procedures, new procurement procedures in the fiscal chapter, chapter 2. And I'll be basically commenting on that most of the time. Now, basically, this economic survey looks at utilization of defense expenditure, that is primarily the capital expenditure, with a view of promoting self-reliance as well as encouraging private sector participation in defense sector, which I feel is a very good move in the last 1 year. Now, coming to specifics, it talks of increased FDI from 49% to 74% in the defense manufacturing. And it also talks of increase in capital expenditure vis-a-vis the previous year, but it talks of increase in the absolute terms. Whereas I feel defense capital expenditure also needs to change in terms of ratio of revenue versus capital, because that has actually seen a reverse, which aspect this economic survey is not bringing in. It talks in terms of additional allocation, but actually when we compare from 2010-11, where the capital expenditure was 36% of the total defense expenditure, it has come down to just about 25%, which I'm sure in the coming budget or something, I want to see upturn. They also talk of a very important aspect, this talk of utilization of capital budget, and they talk of the reversing of trend from 2016-17 onwards. That means before that, yes, there was at times the complete expenditure was not taking place, what was allocated, but it talks of that the utilization has seen a change, total upturn. That is a very positive sign. Coming to the defense acquisition procedure, it talks of alignment with the Atmanirbhar Bharat and a number of initiatives which have been taken by the government has been highlighted. Especially very important one was the first one, where notification of lists of weapons and platforms ban on import. That is something which is really very, very important decision, in terms of there is a list of 100 such weapons and platform, to name a few, some simulators, then howitzers, then bulletproof jackets, offshore patrol vehicles, survey vessels, floating dock, and sniper rifles, which were earlier towed RT guns, tracked self-propelled RT guns, short-range surface-to-air missiles, which were earlier importing. Now the ministry has put a ban on the report, showing that our self-sufficiency moving towards that. That, I think, is a very good sign which the ministry has done. Thereafter, coming on to indigenization of sports, they have highlighted 3 methods at RFI stage. They have highlighted that explore the willingness of the prospective foreign vendor to manufacture the spares in the Indian ecosystem. That's one of the very good things. Second one was the new category of maintenance, repair, and overall facility of equipment through the subsidiary in India. That also is a welcome move. And co-production through the intergovernment agreement, that of course was there, and that also is something which is very important. Now, another aspect which I find which was very relevant is the time-bound defense procurement. You see, defense procurements at times go for a long time in terms of negotiation, other things, and that was the reason I feel in the earlier times, especially prior to 2016, when this we are not able to utilize the complete budget. The reason was the long this thing of procurement procedures. So that they have introduced time-bound defense procurement procedure and faster decision making, and establishment of a PMU, project management unit, has been mandated with every support contract management. So that is, I think, a very good move which has been done. It will make our procurement faster and transparent. Coming to the manufacturing part, make and innovation was a very good move, I think, which has been highlighted in this economic survey. Make 1, make 2, and make 3. 3 types of innovations. Only thing I find where there could have been more, this thing is self-reliance in defense production. They are saying that the ordnance factories and public sector undertakings and the private sector ecosystem will be promoted. I feel the R&D aspect needs. Actually, what I would suggest is that, at this stage, what India needs to be, shifting from an assembly nation to a innovative nation, right? So right now, in most of the things, we are assembling the equipment. That I think they have also included that aspect, but that needs to have much more focus in the coming years, I feel. Also, it talks of some policy initiatives like innovation and defense excellence. Yes, this is the thing I was talking about, especially with MSMEs and new startups and R&D. Whereas R&D, I think, needs a little more push. Maybe in the coming budget, we could see something more allocated for R&D and the private sector in the defense. Then, as far as private sector participation is concerned, the FDI initially in 2001, when we opened up the private sector in the defense manufacture, it was 26% which was permitted. Now it has gone up to 74% under the automatic route and above 74% through the government route. That also is a very good initiative which is taken in 2020. And go a long way in making us more self-sufficient as far as the defense equipment is concerned. As far as the export of the defense equipment is concerned, it is highlighted that by the ordnance factories, from about 4,600 crores in 2017-18, it has gone up to about 9,000 crores of export. So overall, I would see what I see is a lot of initiatives are coming in, and that is the need of the hour. India is the second largest arms importer, and I think we need to give more focus on own production and manufacturing, and that is only possible when we invest in R&D and we dovetail the private sector in the R&D as well as manufacture. So right now there has been a lot of incentives for private sector to come for the manufacturing part. I feel in the coming time, even promoting R&D, because in the long run, R&D will help us, devise our own weapon systems and platform. So I'll end here. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mahendrapal Singh. I just highlight a couple of things. One, of course, as Dr. Mahendrapal has emphasized, the private sector, I think the initiatives relating to private sector involvement in defense production, I think, are gaining speed, and hopefully over the next 3 years we will see much more visible results of that. The second one, which I think you said or implied, that it's very important to raise the defense capital expenditure as a percent of GDP. Not just talk about raising in absolute value. It is very, very important given the new challenges, which particularly given or even more because of the challenge which we have faced in 2020. And the third on R&D, given the proliferation of new technologies which are coming, etc., we need a much better framework for both for allocation of funds and for doing R&D into kind of futuristic technologies, so as not to be left behind. With that, I think we have 10 minutes or so for this, and I noticed there are about 3 questions which were directed at me. So let me which I saw on the chat. I noted them somewhere here. 1 second. Oops, where were they gone? I was going to answer them. Where was it? Okay, anyway, let me try and, because I noted the names also. Let me see if I can find them. So first one was, oops. Okay, let me just give me a second to find the, I noted them here somewhere. Anyway, I'm sorry if I don't remember your names, but maybe Dr. Charan Singh, they were right in the beginning. But I remember the 3 questions. So let me answer. I think first one, okay, let me see if I can find the names. First one was by Antisha Nigam. So she was asking me to clarify when I said about GDP and V-shape. So basically, what our research showed was that the lockdown shut down roughly 60% of the economy, which employed roughly 50% of the labor force. Now, this was not exact. It was not implemented the same way by every state, etc. So there is, in detail, there will be variation. But when you shut down 60% of the economy, or even say 50%, you expect the GDP to halve. When you lift the lockdown, you expect most of this to revive. So, and this is what we tried to explain in our papers, which I gave you a thing. You can go to our website and find all these papers. It's such a simple concept, but you'll be amazed that the star economists of this country have still not been able to grasp this simple thing. There can be little refinements. Okay, if it fell down by 50%, is it going to rise by 50 or 52% or 49? There can be some argument about that. But I just don't find how they can't understand that when you clamp it down, it'll go down. If you take it off, it'll rise. It has nothing to do with, sophisticated analysis of fiscal policy, monetary policy, all this. Okay, so that was the point I was trying to make. The second, again, a straightforward question was from Ayush Chowdhury about the concept of income distribution. So here is the thing. Normally, when we talk about income distribution, we are talking about private income. The income you receive in terms of money, in terms of your hands, and how you spend it. It doesn't include public goods normally. What are public goods? Public goods are, for example, if you live in a village and there is no road, you are deprived. When your village gets connected by road or government water supply or sewage system, your general level of living improves. That is not counted. If that happens, it does not appear in the normal concepts of income distribution. So I was trying to distinguish these 2 aspects. Now, there's a third aspect. When government supplies free food, for example, right? So government in 2022 gave free food to, I don't know how many million, somebody may remember the exact number, but that will not be captured in the NSS survey, because NSS survey only asks people how much money you spent. So actually, if you were buying food in 2019 and in 2020 you got it free, if you just use the NSS survey on expenditures on consumption, there will appear to be a worsening of your position. It's a very peculiar thing, which again, many people don't understand. Can you imagine? I mean, at some other point, maybe we'll give a talk on this, but that is how things are done. So these 2 factors are not properly measured. The in-kind transfers given by government or NGOs are not valued. If you were doing the logical economic thing, you would take the amount, put a value to it, and attribute that income to the poor guy. That is not done. So the actual measures which we use commonly do not measure these 2 things. Okay, that is what I was referring to when I talked about income distribution. The third question is by Professor Swami S. Subramaniam. Sorry, not S. No, sorry. No, he just made a comment. So Professor, I think Vignereshwara Swami asked a question on savings and capital formation prior to the pandemic. Now, we have a paper on this, but let me summarize what our analysis showed. This paper, I think, EGROW paper in 2019 or 2018, what that shows is that 90 to 95% of the decline which everybody keeps talking about was due to household saving and direct investment, right? So the way the thing works is you have savings which go into the financial system and then somebody borrows and invests. But there is also a portion which is attributed in the national account statistics. When I, as I'm a villager or I'm a small enterprise, if I save something and invest it, okay, in any kind of structure or machinery, I set up a little machining thing, that is counted as direct saving and investment. So 95% of the decline which you are asking me about, we showed was just due to this household and investment in structure. It didn't affect the financial system. It didn't affect the investment by the corporate. So it's a very interesting thing. I would urge you to read that paper if you are interested further in it. Okay, so let's see. I don't know, Charan, do you want to, or should we open up to questions? We are at 7. I mean, I can probably spare another 5-10 minutes because I have some other thing, but
sure.
Do you think there are any other questions? Surjit, while we are waiting, do you want to say a little bit on the distribution, income distribution, as you have studied it extensively?
Yeah. So very quickly first on capital formation, everybody compares to 2007 when the investment rate was 35% of GDP. Now it is like taking the peak, which was in the context of very, very high rate of growth of income that we had in the global crisis, etc. So the simple point on investment rate, to the extent that we are looking for implications for growth rates, that our investment rate is not that much lower than what it should be, or that what can generate 6 to 7% GDP growth. But our GDP growth has declined. I'm talking about prior to COVID. And I think a large part of the GDP growth decline had to do with very, very high real interest rates. So just a comment that investment is obviously a function of the real interest rate, and growth is a function of both investment and the efficiency of investment, which has to do with where the real interest rate is. So that's point number one. Point number two on inequality. Look, prior to COVID, world inequality was at its lowest level since 1870. So we make a big thing about inequality. It's mostly about the top 1%, and the discussion and has precious little to do with inequality in general. Second, most developing countries have shown an improvement in inequality coming into COVID. All of Latin America has very high inequality levels, but the delta there is positive, that is less inequality. Same story with Africa. The delta, very, very high, Gini's somewhere in the 60s range, but an improvement. Asia, it's about a steady state inequality. So, and the same story with the US and Western. So I think the COVID episode has certainly increased inequality around the world. It has hurt the poor more everywhere, and the rich have definitely got richer relative to in inequality terms. over the last year. I don't, these are very, very, as I mentioned, long-term trends in inequality. I'm not talking about political and what people find fashionable to talk about, but the long-term trend of inequality in the world is towards greater equality, and that has to do with the expansion of education. So, it is, in my view, lamenting about inequality, whether in a COVID year, I hope it's temporary, I think it's temporary, or otherwise is much ado about nothing.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I don't, yeah, I guess there were, yeah, there's a question for Charan, as I see. Charan, have you seen your questions? You want to just answer them?
I would be happy to answer, but the question on transmission of the monetary policy, I thought fiscal authority didn't want to speak much on that.
Yeah, so he said very clearly, right.
So that is one reason. And, in the audience, I got a message on my cell phone. Mr. Tripathi wanted to ask you a question.
On what?
Mr. Tripathi, are you there? Krishnan Tripathi? But I got it on my cell phone. I would like him to ask. He didn't say what question.
Yes, sir, I am here.
Yeah, you want to ask a question?
Sir, in economic survey, I have a question for Mr. Virmani and for you also. In the economic survey, Chief Economic Advisor made a very strong case for borrowing and spending money on infrastructure, saying that it will revive the economy. And he says it will be sustainable because there is a gap between effective interest rate and growth rate. So India's debt expansion will be sustainable. To what extent you agree with this point of view, and for how many years we should follow this path, and by when we should start coming back to the path of fiscal consolidation?
I think this question has been answered already, but anyway, I will add, the classic equations which Dr. Charan Singh hinted at. There are basically two aspects. It's called, one is a primary deficit, and the second is this R minus G. And I think, these are standard things. This is not a question of opinion. And they're almost now well accepted arithmetical things as far as the fiscal deficit is concerned. Now, what is disputed is, as Dr. Bhalla pointed out, what is the effect of the fiscal deficit on other things? The debt GDP ratio, how that path is done is a kind of standard accepted theory, which is not really a debatable subject. There are two factors and one can do the arithmetic. So, Charan, do you want to add anything to that? I mean, we don't have too much time, but if you want to quickly add something.
Yeah, I thought Dr. Bhalla may like to say something on that because he was hinting at it. So, and then I can come after that, sir. Bhalla sir, would you like to say something?
No, look, on the fiscal deficit, it's, as Arvind just said, we need to know what are the consequences of fiscal deficit. Now, first, over a long period of time, especially in India, as well as in other parts of the world, it was thought that the fiscal deficit was one of the more important macro variables which affects inflation, growth rate, savings rates, everything. In the rest of the world, the fiscal importance of fiscal deficit has really, really diminished. And including at the IMF, that especially since COVID started, but I think the trend was there before. I can't speak for the future, but the present scenario, the present thinking at the IMF is that the fiscal deficit is not something that countries should worry about as they emerge from the crisis. I think this is my own personal view. I think this will follow through over the next several years, that the macro, and this is what I was alluding to, there is a new macro in the world, and none of the things that we all held dear are going to be that relevant. So in the new macro, inflation is not a problem. In the new macro, you have lower for longer interest rates. And so I think, so therefore, the debt is not going to be as much of a problem as you once thought because of precisely the debt dynamics. So I think, let's see whether India and the authorities in India move towards a less or more benign view, or somewhat of a benign view on the implications of the fiscal deficit. I think the concentration should be much more on raising tax compliance, not in raising tax rates, but in raising tax compliance to generate more revenue for the income distribution and redistribution policies that this government has rightly championed, and that was there in the last chapter on bare minimum, on the bare necessities. I'll stop there. Thank you.
I'd like to simply say, Mr. Tripathi, that when I joined the Reserve Bank in 1984, it's almost 5-6 years back that the country started recording deficit on their revenue account. And it was then considered it'll explode within no time. The Domer equation, which basically says that the growth of the economy is higher than the rate of interest, then the debt is sustainable. We have already had, nobody is conversing for profligacy or irresponsible fiscal behavior. What we are suggesting, and what Dr. Bhalla is talking about, the new macro, or what the chapter is suggesting, is in case we are able to deploy our resources borrowed in a productive way and growth is higher than the interest rate, then we are on a sustainable path. In any emerging country like ours, we need to invest and we need to put money into productive places. So therefore, if we are able to find productive places to put our money, I think we are on a good course and we are on a sustainable debt. As you have noticed, in most of the countries of the world, debt to GDP ratio has exceeded 100 already. And we are still in the range of 75 to 80. That means fiscal prudence is already being practiced here, ingrained in our system. Thank you.
Dr. Virmani ji, Dr. Charan Singh ji, and Dr. Bhalla ji. I am Subramanian from RBI, ex-RBI. Will you permit me to say one word, sir? Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible, but monetary policy, we have a discussion on, I think on the second. Policy. So, but anything else, yeah.
Yeah, no monetary policy, Dr. Virmani.
Right.
It's
Please.
only Dr. Venkatramana, our Venkatramana, ex-governor, Reserve Bank. He was the chairman of the Madras Roundtable, for which I was also a part of the organizing team during 2007, 2008, and all that from Chennai. And Mr. Venkatramana was also contributing to newspapers. He had very clearly said that he does not believe in fiscal deficit theory, number one. And number two, he does not also believe much about the efficacy of FRBM Act. This was recorded in the public domain. And then I fully support Dr. Bhalla and Dr. Charan Singh and you also on this point that fiscal deficit does not carry much weight. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Charan, unless you see some important question, I'm going to kind of conclude. Anybody want to add anything, or speakers? Does anybody want to say something on any topic, and then we'll conclude? Okay. So let me hand over to you, Charan, then. I conclude this session. And you can give your future programs, I guess you concluded with, right?
Yes. I have some important announcements to make. The first announcement is the union budget is going to be discussed by EGROW Foundation tomorrow, 5:30 to 7, with the same panelist as you have heard today. So I invite you to please come and participate. On February 2, we are having the shadow monetary policy, and the shadow monetary policy committee will be discussing it. The monetary policy, which is going to be announced by the RBI on February 5. On February 5, 5:30 p.m., we have expert panel to discuss the union budget 5 days after it has been presented. So this week is full of economic feast for all of you, and we request you to kindly participate and encourage us in organizing such webinars. Those were the announcements which I wanted to bring to your notice. I will be sending the flyers today in the evening, tomorrow, as well as on 4th. Thank you. So I must thank everybody for this excellent interaction. Dr. Bhalla has joined from Washington, D.C. early in the morning. That's why in his greetings, he said good morning and good evening, because he knew he is in the morning state and we are in the evening state. So I must thank each one of the speakers and the participants to spare time on a Sunday. But country is passing through such exciting economic events, we thought we will do it even on a Sunday. And I'm happy to see the number of participants here. So see you all tomorrow evening for a detailed and mature, sober analysis on the union budget. Thank you.
Just, I would add, Charan, you forgot to mention that the recording will be available by noon tomorrow, right? If they want to tell their colleagues and others if they want to watch this present.
Recording will be available by noon tomorrow on our website. We'll also put it on the Twitter. But such an excellent discussion, you may like to even use it in your classrooms later on. Thank you very much.